For decades, if you were a foreign company in China, you probably operated under a quiet assumption that to really succeed, you had to play by certain unwritten rules. Well, that assumption isn't just outdated anymore, it's a dangerous liability. The whole landscape of bribery in China hasn't just changed. It has been completely torn up and rewritten from scratch.
So that leads us to a really critical question for any professional operating in China today. Is that old strategy of just doing as the locals do still viable? As a decade of high-profile cases now shows, the answer is an absolute definitive no. The ground is completely shifted.
Think about it. What used to be chalked up as just a cost of doing business has now become a high-voltage red line, and crossing it no longer just risks a fine. It risks the entire future of your business, not only within China, but on the global stage as well. So to really understand just how high the stakes are now, we've got to talk about the one landmark case that sent massive shockwaves through the entire international business community, and that's the story of GlaxoSmithKline. When investigators started digging into GSK's operations, what they found wasn't just a couple of rogue employees. Not at all. They uncovered a company-wide philosophy, an internal motto: no expenses, no sales. Bribery wasn't some dirty little secret. It was baked right into the business model, systematically built into employee KPIs and even departmental budgets. And in 2014, the consequences of that system became painfully clear. A Chinese court slammed GSK with a mind-blowing 3 billion RMB fine. Back then, that was nearly $500 million US. It was the largest corporate fine in Chinese history, and it sent a very clear signal. On top of that, several executives, both Chinese and foreign, were handed actual prison sentences.
But here's the real kicker, especially for any international company listening right now. That massive fine? That was just the beginning. The consequences of bribery in China do not stay in China. They set off a global chain reaction.
So here's how this global domino effect actually works. The conviction in the Chinese court established bribery as an undeniable legal fact. Well, that fact immediately gets the attention of regulators back in the United States. Under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, the U.S. can prosecute corruption that happens abroad if it involves U.S.-listed companies. So for GSK, this meant a whole second investigation and millions more in penalties. A single act in China led to severe punishment in two of the world's most powerful legal systems.
Okay, so the GSK case was a huge warning shot, right? But it wasn't a one-off. It was really the first sign of a widening crackdown that has since caught many other multinational companies. And as investigators dug deeper, they found that a lot of these companies were following a disturbingly similar playbook.
I mean, you look at Siemens, which was caught delivering cash for hospital deals hidden away in fruit boxes. Or Pfizer, Avon, and IBM, all of them hit with huge fines for improper payments. But here's the common thread, the big takeaway from all of these cases. It was the use of third-party intermediaries, consultants, travel agencies, local agents to hide the money trail. For any company working in China, this is a critical takeaway. Your biggest compliance risk is very often with the partners you hire.
But hang on, there's another huge shift in how this is all being enforced, and it completely changes the risk equation. For years, the story was always about foreign companies bribing Chinese officials. Well, that's now a two-way street. China is now actively prosecuting its own companies for bribery committed outside its borders.
A perfect example of this is the case of the China Railway Tunnel Group. Its employees got caught bribing officials in Singapore. But they weren't just prosecuted there, they were also tried and sentenced back home in China under a law specifically targeting the bribery of foreign officials. The signal here is crystal clear. Chinese anti-corruption law now has a global reach, and it follows its companies wherever they go.
All right, so all of this brings us to the really big turning point, the legal overhaul of 2024. If the last decade was a series of warnings, these new laws are a fundamental rewriting of the entire rulebook. The focus is shifted, and the penalties, especially for the person giving the bribe, are now far, far more severe.
See, in the old days, the legal focus was mostly on punishing the official who took the bribe. A company could sometimes argue it was pressured into it. That whole argument? It's gone. The new reality is a laser focus on punishing the bribe giver with consequences that go way beyond just fines. We're talking about being completely shut out of the market.
And at the very heart of these new rules is something you absolutely need to know about: the briber blacklist. From a risk management standpoint, this is the ultimate threat. Getting your company on this list means you can be banned from government contracts, denied essential permits and licenses, and watch your corporate credit rating and access to financing just get destroyed. Basically, it's a commercial death sentence. and authorities are especially targeting high-risk sectors like healthcare, finance, and education.
Okay, so with all that in mind, how in the world does a foreign company navigate this new, high-stakes environment? Well, it's not about being afraid. It's about being prepared and being proactive. So let's walk through a practical playbook for building a compliance program that can actually hold up.
A really solid compliance framework for China stands on 4 key pillars. You can think of it as a continuous cycle. It starts with codifying your rules, then scrutinizing your partners, then realigning your internal culture, and finally, having a clear process to report and fix any issues. Let's quickly break down what that actually means for you in practice.
All right, your first 2 pillars are all about your external defense. First, you have to codify your policy. A generic global statement just won't cut it. You've got to have a specific anti-bribery policy for your China operations, and it has to be translated into Chinese so there's zero confusion for your local team. Second, scrutinize your third parties. This means doing deep due diligence on all your agents and consultants and embedding strict anti-bribery clauses into all your contracts, clauses that give you the right to audit and terminate the relationship if you need to.
Okay, the next 2 pillars are all about what's happening inside your company, your internal culture. Third, align your incentives. Look, if you have these crazy aggressive sales targets, you're basically creating a culture where people feel like they have to cut corners. Your compensation needs to reward ethical, compliant behavior, not just raw sales numbers. And finally, you need a plan to report and remediate. That means a confidential channel for employees to raise concerns without fear and a clear process to investigate issues immediately. In this new environment, self-reporting a violation can make a huge difference in mitigating the penalties. You know, when you really look at cases like GSK and Siemens, the key lesson isn't about the initial bribe. The real damage, the thing that cripples a company, is the long, expensive fallout from trying to cover it up. The legal fees, the damage to your brand, the business disruption, it's all far more devastating than any single fine. The takeaway is clear. Proactive compliance isn't just good practice, it's a core survival strategy.
So, at the end of the day, that whole era of trying to navigate China's unwritten rules, it's over. It's done. For any company that wants to build a sustainable, long-term business in China, the only viable path forward is to completely align with the country's strict and constantly evolving compliance system.
So, I want to leave you with a final question. One you really should take back to your team. Look at your own company's operations in China. Your partners, your sales incentives, your internal controls. The question is, are you really truly prepared for this new reality? Because the game has fundamentally changed, and playing by the old rules is a risk no business can afford to take anymore.